Henry Kissinger, thank you very much for being here. I was just looking at the statistics. Back in 1971, China accounted for less than 5% of GDP. Now it's a fifth of the world GDP. And back then, less than 1% of world trade. And you went there to deal with what you called a strategic adversary. And can you explain what you were trying to do then and the relevance to today?
The world then was dominated by the Cold War and by the hostility between the Soviet Union and the United States. And many of the key decisions, most of the key decisions, started from that premise. Our strategy was to try to bring China into the international system. And partly because of the tension between China and the Soviet Union, we thought that would produce a new element and would change the pattern of the Cold War, as in the event it did. But when I went there, we knew very little about China, but they knew a lot about us because the Chinese negotiators had read everything I'd ever written.
But do you think the China of then was willing to do a deal, or do you think it was inevitable that it did a deal with America?
Well, we were not so much trying to make a deal as to create a situation in which the self-interests of China and the United States coincided enough so we could break the pattern of the Cold War. So I did not go there to make a precise deal, but to discuss the invitation to President Nixon to China. And after that, we concentrated on explaining each other's thinking to each other sufficiently so that tensions, when they arose, grew out of a common framework, and parallel policies could develop. And that in turn had a major impact on the Soviet calculations and in time on those of the rest of Asia.
And in terms of the common framework nowadays, do you see some of the same elements to bring in somebody who has some elements of a strategic adversary?
Well, now we are in a sense in a diametrically opposite condition. The framework, the negotiations in those days started from an adversarial position and moved step by step, fairly rapidly, towards cooperation. Right now, we are part of it's more of essentially the same world order. But the evolution of the components of that world order has been more rapid than one could assume in those days. So China, which, as you pointed out, was a minor economic participant in 1971, developed a momentum and a capacity that altered the economic and commercial balances, so that independent of the attitudes of the governments was going to create new problems. And that is the process in which we are now engaged.
So you see this the rapidity of the way in which China has evolved is in some sense at the cause of some of the current tensions.
But China has become a substantially new player that can compete with the United States in various fields And so we are bound to step on each other's toes around the world. The challenge is to maintain a fundamentally cooperative relationship amidst inherent differences of approach produced in large part by the changing technology and in some part due to the different philosophic approaches to challenges between the United States and China.
And what is the framework for doing that, for keeping that partnership?
Well, I believe that it is essential for China and the United States to explain to each other what the objectives are that they feel they must achieve and what the concessions are that they must not be asked to make, and the concessions each is willing to make, and not to get lost in a lot of detail before you know where you're trying to go.
And where do you see the common objectives? You talked a bit earlier about different philosophies. Maybe you can talk about where you see the commonalities and where are the differences.
Well, one inherent problem is that Americans, on the whole, think that if there is a problem, there's a short-term solution and deal with it The Chinese, on the other hand, think that problems are never completely solved and that every solution is an admissions ticket to a new set of problems. So once one grants this difference in perspective, I think if the world order becomes defined by continuous conflict between the United States and China, sooner or later it runs the risk of getting out of control, which was the history of how World War I broke out in Europe. And so some disagreements are inevitable. But the objective needs to be that both countries recognize that a fundamental conflict between them will destroy hopes for a world order and run too great risks of conflict. And I think that objective can be achieved. And I'm in fact fairly optimistic that it will be achieved.
Does that solution involves a changing structure? Are there structural changes that would help make that relationship better?
Well, structural changes are inherent in the evolution of modern technology. I think the mechanisms for dialogue exist, but it has to be defined in a manner in which not every disagreement on commercial matters turns into a test case, and in which both sides realize that the elaboration of the new international order is a task that is greater in importance than most of the day-to-day disputes.
Do you think the Chinese understand the world order that you described in your last book, that there is an idea, that there is a necessity of having some degree of balance in the way the world is run?
Well, the Chinese have not had to experience a relationship of balance with others since they've been, through most of their history, the dominant country in the region. But it is one of the challenges of their adjustment to recognize that this is now not a balance of power as so totally as to recognize that the evolution cannot be forced and needs to be understood. I think both sides will have to learn adaptations of their history.
Which particularly on America, which adaptation of their history do the Americans need to learn?
The Americans have to learn that not every crisis is caused by ill will. And also that there is a difference between educating people and learning to cooperate with them. So not every disagreement with us is a lack of understanding that we need. So we need to understand that the new world is not necessarily an adaptation of everything with which we are familiar. But on the other hand, we have done great things in building world orders, especially after the Second World War. So I'm optimistic that we will find a way.
You mentioned the end of the 19th century and what happened then, the end of the first great age of globalization. If you look back then, you see a group of people, in Britain particularly, who were simply ideologically in the position they did not want to see Germany rise. Do you think there is a big body of people in America who simply do not want China to become the world's biggest economy?
Probably. There is such a group of people. But at the end of the 19th century, nobody understood the consequences on war of modern technology. And none of the leaders who went to war in August 1914 would have done so had they known what the world would look like in 1918. We know what the world would look like if America and China are in military conflict. So the incentive to understand that our world requires adjustments, and even the weapons technology is changing in a way where you can no longer be sure that the weapons interpret the targets to which they're assigned in the same way as their originators, so that chaos is built into confrontation, even technologically. So when the leaders of both countries examine their historic options, they, in my view, will come to the conclusion that they may have to find a way to solve these issues jointly.
Do you worry, one last thing, about the generational change? We saw pictures of you back from the 1970s. Wang Xishan lived through the Cultural Revolution. There have been people who have seen real changes. You now have a new generation of people who are only used to the world economy going forward, and there not being these fundamental conflicts, and that is something different.
When you live long enough, as I have met many of the leaders, of course, there are different personalities. The early Chinese leaders I met went through a revolution. And in America, different types of leaders were in office. And Nixon was very creative in understanding the philosophical aspects. So there is a new generation. I cannot believe that they will concentrate, that they will turn, if the commercial issues are turned into strategic issues, and if the strategic issues are turned into a contest between two power centers, the world will be in terrible shape. But I don't believe that is inevitable, and I think the leaders who study the realities will come to different conclusions.
So you remain fundamentally an optimist?
I'm not permanently I'm trying to be a realist.
A paranoid optimist?
And I think what I've said is going to happen. There's always the problem. In the 19th century, the philosopher Kant said, someday the world will achieve universal peace. The only challenge is whether it will come about through understanding or through catastrophe. I think we have high incentives to avoid catastrophe.
That is a very optimistic way in which to end this brief conversation.
I think it's a duty.
Yeah.
It's not a prediction.
It depends on what people do.
It depends on how people interpret what they're living through, to understand that some sacrifices have to be made for adjustments, and to understand how the other side views reality and changes. This is a big task, but the challenge is also vast.
Dr. Kissinger, thank you very much for this conversation.